Welcome to a new episode of Master Your Mistakes. Today we have Jean-Miguel Uva, who is founding partner of Bello Partners. He's recently been featured in City AM and has founded Bello Partners to bridge the information gap between organizations and what's happening on the ground in Venezuela.
Thank you for having me, Jesse.
Excellent. Okay, so could you give people an overview of what exactly Bello Partners does and how it helps organizations?
So we are a strategic advisory firm, as you said, helping businesses and organizations entry, re-entry, or operate safely here in Venezuela. A lot has changed in the last few months, and what we're trying to do is help those businesses understand the risks and opportunities, how they could navigate those safely, how they could help invest and improve the country here, and at the same time, obviously, benefit the shareholders and investors.
Excellent. And what sort of areas of the economy would these businesses be looking at? What are the opportunities? What are the risks as well?
So it is very interesting. Since the beginning of the year, we've been seeing a lot of interest from pretty much every sector and every region around Venezuela. Things are quite exciting right now. If you go to the business district, you'll see a lot of people talking English, a lot of businessmen from abroad and women. Things that perhaps at the end of last year or even in early 2025, you wouldn't really see. And the reason for that is because after the US intervention, the political framework and business environment is changing very rapidly here. What we're trying to do is to help those organizations understand whether it's the right time or not. So you were asking what businesses are prime positions. And I think if you look at the energy sector is where you find the sort of companies that are more willing now to take the risk and come here and invest. So oil, gas, mining, and some companies around the infrastructure / electricity sector. Doesn't mean there's no interest in other sectors. So we've spoken with, for example, investment funds, mass retail companies, some tech companies that have, they're seeing the opportunities that could come by investing in Venezuela, but the risk tolerance of those organizations tend to be slightly different from the ones in energy heavy industry.
Mm-hmm. And when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, one of the words that you used to describe the Venezuelan economy was actually quite resilient. Could you explain what you mean by that? What parts of the economy are resilient and why is that?
So it is no surprise for anybody to know that the state of the current Venezuelan economy is quite weak. We've seen sort of drops of the GDP, both in nominal terms and per capita terms, over half percentage points in the last 10 years. And that obviously has affected the quality of life for a lot of people here and the business environment. However, despite that, what I've seen and we've seen here is you have a lot of resilient companies that have managed to weather that storm. So companies that have survived very stringent regulations, very difficult taxation, sort of the loss of a lot of the market base in the economy. And those companies are still here. Some of them are doing really well, especially in areas like infrastructure, areas like retail. We've seen in the last 5 years or so a real boom in relative terms of the tech sector here, with sort of native domestic answers to things like Uber or Deliveroo coming here. And these are companies that have been facing the same challenges than those sort of traditional businesses, but actually doing quite well, usually led by young entrepreneurs. And in that context, now with the economy reopening, with hopes of foreign investment, these are the sort of businesses that are very well positioned not only to participate in M&A, so being bought or sold to foreign investors, but also to become supply chain partners for all those businesses looking to invest. Most of them are actually serious, reliable businesses. And in a world where things do get better in the longer term in the country, I can see them not only being a big part of the economy here, but actually expanding to the region as well.
Mm-hmm. And where do you predict most of that foreign investment comes from? Do you think it will be overwhelmingly the US, or do you also think there might be parts of Europe or other regions that might also be interested or engaging with it?
So I think it's a quite interesting question. We've seen a lot of interest, really, from every region. The risk tolerance of companies in certain countries, certain sectors, vary enormously, right? So if you are an oil company in the US and you come here with the energy secretary, for example, then you're probably more likely to take the risk and at least seriously explore how to get in the country, right? We've seen European companies actually being a bit more risk averse. And there are very good reasons for that. There are ESG concerns in the energy sector, for example. There is questions around institutions and how regulation will affect their operations in the long term. But when we also talk to companies in Latin America, big corporations in places like Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, these are companies that are not, they don't have a sexy name or work in areas perhaps that are more day-to-day, like concrete or cement. They're multi-billion dollar pound companies. They seem to be a bit more excited than European companies to come here, partly because of they also operate in legal, political, economic frameworks that are not the same that you see in the Western markets, partly because of how close they are to Venezuela. And perhaps, and this is just my hunch, because they are more optimistic about it, whether that's based on rational thinking or not. That's certainly when you speak to a Colombian businessman or a Mexican executive, you do sense more of an excitement in the voice, depending on the age. It's quite an interesting point, actually. If you speak to someone that is 50, 60-year-old person, someone that knew Venezuela in the 80s and 90s and saw the sort of the wealth that the country had then, is very different if you speak to a 30-year-old entrepreneur who've only seen negative headlines about the country. So I think there's a generational element there as well.
Mm-hmm. Could you expand on that in terms of what are the different personas, the different people in the Venezuelan economy, and what are their views on whether this will be good or whether it will just be challenging for them?
So if you go back to the 70s and the 80s, Venezuela sort of operated as one of the hubs in Latin America for businesses. You had a lot of international corporations headquarters here, and that would be the regional office. So you had a lot of executives that perhaps came here in the 20s and 30s and saw how much money there was to be made, how great the country was. And then for whatever reason, they left and progressed their careers. And now they're probably sitting on some influential positions in that business or any other business. And they're thinking, well, what's the opportunity to go back to how it was or even better? Okay. Obviously, the experience that many professionals in the Western world or elsewhere, when you mention the word Venezuela, would be probably just associated with oil and negative economic headlines. And I think that if you look now as well at the sort of investors that are physically coming here and physically seriously thinking about how to invest and how can we make this work, They tend to be more senior, seasoned executives that maybe the firms had operations here, and they're thinking about how do we avoid the mistakes of the past and make this work long term, or simply they had exposure to the country in a professional capacity back in 2 or 3 decades ago.
Mhm. And in terms of Bello Partners and the role that you're playing, what are the questions that you're getting on both sides, and what are the answers that you're giving?
For us to do our job well at Bello Partners would be to make sure that we're helping those businesses understand the risks and helping mitigate those risks of coming and investing here, and helping the country as well, Venezuela, get that investment, right? So in a way, our job is to be a bridge. Venezuela has been outside of the international picture for a few years now. So whether that is, for example, from the SWIFT system of international payments, the country is and has been sanctioned, although that is changing now to some extent. There are very few flights from abroad to come to the country. At the moment, although this is changing right now, Venezuela-US flights are not allowed on a commercial route. So the country has been sort of separated a little bit from the international community. And in that period, what you've seen is actually Latin America as a region as a whole growing a fair bit in terms of industry, tourism, finance, and so on. And so our job is to help investors and executives understand what it means when, for example, a public official or a politician say X or Y, what it means when something happens or doesn't happen, help them connect as well with the potential commercial partners here on the ground, and translate as well the business culture, which is very different. I mean, and it's not just a question of English or Spanish. It's really understanding, well, if a supplier tells me that a product will be delivered by Friday afternoon, is it actually going to be delivered on Friday afternoon? There's the cultural sensitivities that we also help clients navigate and understand here, which are obviously different if you're operating in Europe, Asia, or the US, for example.
Mhm. And on that point around timelines, one of the things that you spoke about there were flights in and out of Venezuela, specifically between the US and Venezuela. Could you give potentially a prediction on how long you think it will take that sort of market to develop and mature and be much more similar to other uh, Latin American countries?
So I think that's a very interesting question, because unlike many other Latin American or countries or emerging economies, Venezuela actually has pretty decent infrastructure in general terms. It needs a lot of repair and upgrading, that is for sure. But there's a difference between building a road, an airport, port, than to repairing it in terms of investment needed, in terms of the time it takes. So to answer your question about the US Venezuela flights specifically, the US government and the Venezuelan authorities are already working on this very closely. American Airlines has already positioned itself as the first company willing to re-enter the market. And then remember, Miami and Caracas only a 3.5 hour flight. Is a pretty close flight if you think about it. And the hubs that would connect, whether it's Caracas, Miami, Maracaibo, which is sort of the oil city in the west of the country, with Houston, for example, they are pretty profitable routes, and it would allow not only normal Venezuelans to do tourism and go to the US, which is still a country that most people here like to visit, but also business people to come in and out of the country. And actually, rather than just hearing it from me, to see what it's like, right, in person, to see what the city is like, to see what they hear or see in the news reflects the reality on the ground, which is in a way what we also try to inform and bridge.
Mhm. Makes sense. Makes sense. And focusing in on the headlines versus the reality, my understanding so far from everything you've said is that the big kind of disconnect is that most headlines are quite negative, but from your point of view, actually, there's a lot of reason for optimism. Is that fair to say?
I would say that what we've been seeing in the last few months is what I call quiet optimism.
Hmm.
We were talking about resilience. Part of the reason why Venezuelan businesses and people have been so resilient is because I think they have an innate sense of cynicism in them. So uh, it is true that you have executives coming to Caracas, you have um, businesses discussing potential entry or re-entry into the country, but nothing big has yet materialized. And I think a lot of people and businesses are also expecting, I suppose, that first signal when a flagship US Western company comes back and says, right, we're opening shop again, or when you start actually seeing those deals flow through. I personally think that this is going to be a good year for the Venezuelan economy. I think at least it's very hard to predict the future here, but at least in the short to medium term, we're seeing positive signs in terms of the way the government is redrafting regulation and legislation to accommodate for international investment to come. But there's still a few challenges around in terms of political stability and institutions that I think the current government is very much aware of. It will just take time to see how they address those more systemic, fundamental questions.
Hmm. Hmm. And on that word cynicism, I've got maybe four groups in mind. Um, let's say US international companies, Venezuelan companies, Venezuelan citizens, and Venezuelan entrepreneurs. Where do you think their interests are well aligned? And where do you think there might be some friction between these different groups?
I think it's a good question. The Venezuelan economy, even before Chavismo arrived, uh, has not been for many decades, perhaps even ever, let's say, a fully free market economy. It is the case, at least within the most established Venezuelan business sector, where you see a lot of they see restrictions, regulations, tariffs, protectionist measures, if you want, as a way to protect their own sort of sector or economic interest or specific markets, right? So I think in a way, competition will be challenging for them. Not perhaps in sectors like oil, where you only really have one big actor, which is the Venezuelan government, the state oil company. And there is so much oil that really, there is no problem in bringing other people to kind of exploit it and export it. There's obviously a market for it internationally. I'm thinking more in terms of consumer-facing sectors, or even tech, for example.
Mm.
So going back to my previous example, the reason why Uber doesn't operate here is not because Uber couldn't, for example, set up shop on a technical basis, but rather because of all the different regulations and business environment make it really difficult. And that resulted in a domestic equivalent, right? Which is a very successful business that actually has already expanded abroad. I think, at least from a business perspective, we're very interested to see how the domestic players accommodate, compete with foreign businesses in the banking sector, for example. Let's talk about American banks coming back in retail. If you look at supermarket, for example, it's a very competitive sector already. And then more generally, when you look at the service economy as well, are we going to have the lawyers, the consultants, the whole infrastructure that these big American Western corporations require to operate in normal circumstances?
Mhm.
So I do see friction happening.
Interesting. And, thinking about, the service economies, you mentioned, like consultancies, things like that. what are your thoughts around, given Venezuela is opening up, becoming more of a free market economy, that it might be able to leapfrog some economic developmental stages that other countries have gone through? I even think about the UK and some of our, infrastructure, let's say like broadband or something like that. With big changes in AI, do you think there are elements of the economy, maybe the tech sector, that could actually catch up with developed economies much faster than we might expect?
Absolutely. I think we've been talking actually with some tech companies thinking about this and using Venezuela as a sandbox, as a test for some of those products. Part of the resilience element has meant that Venezuelans have had to adapt pretty quickly, and tech has been a fantastic sort of way for them to adapt. So, sorry. So, for example, when we look at the payment system, right? Paying things in today's economy is somewhat complicated here in Venezuela because sanctions, because currency exchange controls, and so on. Venezuelans have become very, very creative, let's say, in the way they pay. And there has been a lot of different products that have been developed here to accommodate for that. Things that when I actually look back when I look at Europe, there are solutions that could be implemented or exported to other markets. And at the same time, when you look at things like AI, in the telecom sector, for example, the internet penetration is very high in the country. So to answer your question on developmental stages, Venezuelans are already in the internet. Okay, they have phones, they have computers. It's a question whether those entrepreneurs actually come here and say, well, how could we test a product? How could we launch a product? And apply it here in the market. There's definitely, Venezuelans love tech, and they love talking as well. So telecommunications and innovations around AI, for example, are going to be, or e-commerce actually, are going to be quite interesting to see in the next few years, whether it comes domestically or in partnership with foreign entrepreneurs.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And adjacent to that, for the average person in their early 20s, let's say coming out of education or similar, and they're looking for careers, jobs, entrepreneurship, where do you predict the jobs and or work of the future will be in Venezuela, particularly in terms of maybe sectors?
That is a very interesting and challenging question, I think. So I recently saw a study made by one of the major banks here in Venezuela about entrepreneurship. And actually, some of the findings show that, so to one extent, Venezuelans are already some of the most entrepreneurial of young people in Latin America. Another finding is that that rate is actually going down. I'm not really sure why that is the case. I think a lot of people have emigrated as well, and maybe sort of that entrepreneurship is going elsewhere. Specifically looking at the future, I think the service economy will remain a massive piece of the Venezuelan economy. This is and will be an oil-dependent country for many years to come. And it has been the vision of many governments way before Chavismo to diversify it. No one has actually been able to do it. Doesn't mean it will not happen in the future, but it will certainly be the case in the next few years that 80% or so of the Venezuelan income economy will depend on oil and other natural resources. That means in a context of developing Latin American country, that you have a lot of USDs coming in. Venezuela, right? If things go well, right? Let's project and assume that is the scenario. That means the economy will be heavily focused on oil and then consumers, right? The question of whether those USD that come in go out immediately to input stuff, food, cars, machinery, whatever other sort of capital you want to see, whatever sort of capital you may think, is a question I think to be answered, right? Are Venezuelan entrepreneurs going to try to fill that market and say, look, we can become more competitive and produce, for example, food in the country rather than imported? In which case, that's great because those USDs are leaving the country, they're staying in, they're circulating, they're stimulating the economy. Or will that resource-heavy dependence mean that we export all oil and minerals and gas, and then that money goes away again to import all of these things? And I think there are some really, really interesting opportunities there, especially for sectors like specialized manufacturing. I don't think Venezuela or indeed Latin America can seriously compete with Asia or India in terms of mass production. But if you look at, for example, countries like Brazil, which I think is a good example to some extent to what Venezuela could be, they have developed some specialized engineering manufacturing capabilities, like on planes, for example, whether it's for civil aerospace or military aerospace. And Venezuela's lucky as well in its human capital. If you look at the level of education of those who emigrated to Europe or the US, you have, at least in the US, the latest data I saw was 80% of those people have university degrees, right? These are people that are going and working in American companies, for example, or starting their own businesses, seeing the technology, seeing the processes. If some of those people, because I don't think all of them will come back, if some of those people do come back and bring those ideas and experiences, skills, and networks, paired with oil money and natural resources money, I think there are very interesting and exciting opportunities to develop highly specialized manufacturing, agri-tech, or even just normal tech in the country.
Gotcha. And in terms of that return of highly talented, highly educated Venezuelans back to Venezuela, what needs to happen or what needs to continue to happen in order for that to be the case?
I think one of the things that has changed, and for example, in my case, one of the reasons why I came back after living almost 12 years in the UK was that Venezuela went from being one of the most dangerous countries in Latin America to being fairly safe now. Okay. And I think that is a positive development. Regardless of the economic situation, it means that people can just live their life safely without fear of the phone being snapped or being robbed or being kidnapped. And that has been a development from the last 5 years that has actually meant that some, not all of those Venezuelans, have come back. I think another thing that needs to happen is that economic growth to actually materialize, right? Everything that we've been discussing here is about future growth, future opportunities. If those numbers actually go up, if investment does actually happen, if, for example, a big, let's say, oil company X actually comes here and creates jobs, they will have an enormous amount of need to bring back the skilled engineers, for example. Now, if those salaries are competitive, if the quality of life improves, and paired with sort of a sense that you can live your life safely, you have a good formula. The remaining issue here is what happens politically. This is a very polarized country, and there is still a sense of deep division within the social and political part of the country. I don't think that will be resolved anytime soon.
Mhm.
But as long as there are signs that that internal political polarization, if you want to call it, actually gets resolved with time, that will give hope to a lot of people to come back. And not just for businesses to come here and invest. Businesses want predictability. They want to know not where they're going to be next month, where they're going to be in the next 10 years. So it is important for both people and businesses.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And now thinking about yourself, Bello Partners, how quickly did this go from idea to organization? What was your process as an individual to make it happen?
So I came back to Venezuela late last year, way before any of this developments had taken place. And I had it on the back of my mind. I actually came back for personal reasons, family reasons, rather than I'm going to go to Venezuela and help investors come here and bridge this gap. But what we became very clear after the 3rd of January, and by the way, my background in London was that of a consultant already. What became clear to me and my business partner was that, look, we were getting calls and messages from our clients, from people, from colleagues in London, the consultancy sector, asking what's going on, what do you think that's going to happen? This seems very interesting. And what became clear then at that point was, after dashing out some free advice, was that, well, we could actually monetize this, right? We are in Bello Partners is in a very, very special place where you have London Western professionally trained consultants that understands how a CEO in New York or in Munich thinks, that understands the sort of outputs that they need and require to add value to the business and their organization. But we're also here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what our competitors, big firms, do not have. So we realized pretty quickly that we were in a pretty niche space in what is already a niche investment opportunity and country like Venezuela, that is becoming bigger, obviously. And said, look, you're going to have all these execs coming here. They're going to have their legal risk compliance team saying, look, Venezuela is still sanctioned, right, by OFAC, by the US government. How are we going to make this work? How are we going to talk to politicians, to officials, to businesses that we can actually trust? And it became clear that you needed someone that actually provided a strategic counsel and said, do not do this, do this. This way you want to take is complicated. Let's look at around differently. Something that we're very proud of and we were very clear is that we want to be as honest and transparent as possible with our clients. We are a UK registered company, so we have to abide by the UK anti-bribery law. We work with some American companies, and they have something called the FCPA, which is their equivalent, which is in many ways more stringent than UK legislation. But we also have our own training in what's right and what's not right. And in a country like this, there's a premium for that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it reassures those legal compliance risk teams that we actually have someone that understands how they think, but they can apply it at the local level.
Yeah, makes sense. And thinking about yourself now and Bello Partners in 5 years' time, what do you think yourself in 5 years' time will be looking back at this moment? What advice do you think they would give you?
Sorry, could you repeat your question?
So yourself in 5 years' time, when they're looking back at this period of your life, starting Bello Partners and bridging the gap between these different parties, what advice do you think they would give you as an individual, your future self giving you advice?
I like to think that I would say slow and steady wins the race. I think doing things right, even if that means it takes you longer, even if that means you're not chasing all of that new business, or you're not getting all the money and clients and opportunities you want, is more valuable at the beginning when you're a small team than just said, let's just do it. It doesn't matter. Let's go for it. Right. I think what our clients prospects like to see in us is that we dedicate the right amount of time and thought to their problems, and we do it in a way that is verifiable, trusted, right? I'm more interested in building trust and credibility at this stage of Bello Partners than to getting 10 retainers, for example.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Reminds me of the phrase, slow is smooth and smooth is fast.
Yeah, yeah.
And now a final question, again, on yourself as an individual and where you're at this point in your life. What is a favorite quotation that you've got right now and why?
I've been thinking a lot about this in the last couple of months. It's a quote from Harold Wilson, uh, who said that a week is a long time in politics. And it's certainly the case here. Every week, every day, really, sometimes the political space and the business environment is changing. And we have to change with it. We have to uh, be aware of it and be able to advise a client on the current dynamics day to day. And I think that's why I said I think being slow matters, because to be able to fully pay attention, especially when you're in the country, to all of those changes that are so sometimes dramatic and drastic, you really need to be paying attention, and you really need to be focusing on what matters and the value that you want to provide to clients.
Excellent. Makes sense. Super strong note to end on. Really appreciate your time and the breadth of the conversation. I think there are a lot of people who are going to find a lot of value and interest in this.
Nice. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you.